Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey, 9. David had never been in a modern city like Anchorage. When he broke his leg, his parents had taken him to a doctor in one of the small interior towns. Uncle George met him at the airport. They drove through the city's downtown traffic and out into the residential section. Halfway down a street, they turned into a driveway. "Here we are," Uncle George said cheerfully. "Home." The house was 2 stories tall. It was one of the biggest, and David thought the nicest-looking house on the block. His uncle led him into the living room. "Margaret?" Uncle George called. "David's here." His aunt came from the kitchen. She was tall and thin. She had the blondest hair he'd ever seen piled on her head in glistening coils. Her eyes were big and very blue. She shook his hand, smiling. "David, I've been looking forward to meeting you." David said, "Yes, ma'am." She kept smiling at him. "That's quite a get-up you're wearing. You look like an Eskimo or an Indian in it." "My mother was Indian," David said. "I was thinking of that, David. You know, George," she said, "if he got rid of those boots and things, what are they, mucklucks? And the parka, and got some more conventional clothing, a jacket, some sweaters and shoes. A lot of Anchorage people dress this way in winter, Margaret. I see nothing wrong with it." "I know it," Aunt Margaret said. "And I still say out in the bush it's fine, but not in the city. You don't happen to have anything else to wear in that bag, do you, David?" "Some shirts and socks," David said. "If clothing just weren't so expensive," she mused. David remembered his money and brought out his wallet. "I can buy my own clothes. We sold a little fur before I left." He extracted $250 and handed it to his uncle. "This is to help pay for my keep until Scotty sells the furs and traps in the spring. Then I'll give you more." His uncle pushed the money aside. "You're my brother's son, David. We're happy to have you." "I can take it." Aunt Margaret held out her hand, and David gave her the money. "Margaret!" Uncle George said angrily. "I will not take from my brother's boy." "Just a minute," Aunt Margaret said calmly. "I'm glad to have David, too. I hope he understands that, but he has to give, and he has it to give, and he wants to. We have 2 children of our own to support, and we're not exactly rich. If David didn't have it, that would be different. Besides, this will give him a feeling of independence, of paying his own way, not accepting charity. Isn't that right, David?" "Scotty and I talked it over," David said to his uncle. "I want to do this." "Well," Uncle George rubbed his face with an angry gesture that was like David's father. "All right, but I don't like it." Aunt Margaret said, "Show David his room, George." "Then suppose you 2 go downtown and get him some new clothes, the kind we'd get Terry," she explained to David. "Your room's not big and it's not furnished as well as we'd like, but after living out in the bush so long, I don't imagine you'll mind." "For the love of Mike," Uncle George said angrily. "Fred didn't live primitive." "Really?" Aunt Margaret's blue eyes were surprised. "You had electricity, running water, and that sort of thing?" "No," David said. "There, you see," she said to his uncle. Uncle George shook his head and said, "Come on, David." They climbed the narrow winding stairs single file. The room was under the roof. David could stand upright in the middle, but not on the sides where the roof sloped. A single window looked out over the city. There was a bunk bed, a small dresser, and a stand with a bed lamp. One wall was a clothes closet. There was a small rug in front of the bed. "I'm sorry it's not better," Uncle George said. "We never thought we'd use it." "This is fine," David said. "About your aunt, David. She's always lived in the city. She was born and raised in an apartment. She was never more than a few blocks from a beauty parlor until we moved up here. She won't get out and see the country, but sticks to downtown. A moose did come up the street a month ago and chased a couple of people indoors. Now Margaret will hardly walk around the neighborhood. She thinks the minute you get out of the city limits, you're back in the Alaska of 1898. Apparently, it's going to take a lot of time for her to adjust." "Sure," David said. "Now let's go downtown and get those clothes." The store they went to had nothing but men's clothes. David had never seen so many varieties and colors. There were whole racks of pants, coats, jackets of all kinds. Shirts and sweaters were stacked in piles on counters. There was a counter of nothing but socks, another of brightly colored ties. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of boxes of shoes. Uncle George began pawing through a rack of pants. See anything here you like?" David said, bewildered. I like it all." Uncle George smiled. "Want me to pick out a couple of pairs of pants for you?" "You pick it all out. I wouldn't know where to start. Shoes, a couple of pairs of pants, a jacket, shirts, and sweaters will make $100 look sick," Uncle George warned. "I've got enough." A clerk approached, and Uncle George explained what they wanted. The clerk nodded. "The works, eh?" In no time, David was decked out in new shoes, pants, a sweater, stocking cap, and a fleece-lined jacket. It all came to $96. David looked at himself in a full-length mirror. I sure look different. The salesman smiled. They do say clothes make the man. David's parka and old clothing went into a bag, and they left the store. When they reached home, his cousins, Grace and Terry, were there from school. Terry was about a year younger than David and was not as tall. He was thin and blond like his mother and had her blue eyes. He looked David over and said, "Hi, Dave," and was through with him. Grace was just the opposite. She was about 11, David guessed, a little chubby, and her smile was big and friendly. "Hi, Dave," she grinned. Then she looked disappointed. "Gee, I thought you'd look like somebody getting ready to go to the North Pole or something, but you looked like everybody else." "I think you look fine," Aunt Margaret said. "The new clothes are a real improvement." David said to Grace, "My parka and mucklucks are in the bag. I just bought these clothes." "Can I see 'em?" "Sure." David handed her the package. Grace untied it and lifted out the parka. "Wow, what a beauty!" She started to slip it over her head. "Hey, don't do that," Terry warned. "You don't know what kind of dirt it's been in. Dave's been wearing it all over." "I wear it outside and only in winter," David said. "Parkas don't get dirty in snow and 40 below." Grace paid no attention. She got into the parka, which reached well below her knees. She stood in front of the mirror, admiring herself. Aunt Margaret watched. "It looks fine on you, honey," Uncle George said. "It's a mile too big," Terry said. "I could cut the bottom off," Grace said, turning around, "and if I wore 3 or 4 sweaters underneath, it'd almost fit." She smiled at David. "I won't, of course. Cut it off, I mean. But I'd sure like to have one." She slipped out of it and handed it back to David. David took the parka and package and headed upstairs. "Hurry up, David," his aunt said. "Dinner's ready." During dinner, Grace asked, "You going to start school right away, Davy?" "I don't know." David glanced at Uncle George. "I hadn't thought about it." "Margaret and I talked it over," Uncle George said. "And since you'll be entering high school, we thought it would be better to wait until next fall. You'd be coming into the middle of a term now. That's too much to make up." "You had a school out there?" Terry asked, with mock surprise. "You can read and write?" "That's enough," Uncle George said sharply. "You're not funny." "I think what Terry means is that he's surprised they'd have a school in such a small place as Aurora," Aunt Margaret said. "Sure," Terry said. "You can hardly find it on a map." "My teacher was a graduate of the University of Washington," David said. "We studied the same things and took the same exams you do here. I graduated from 8th grade last spring." "You're smarter than we are. I'm only in 6th and Terry's in 8th. I'll start high next fall too," Terry said, "so you won't be ahead of me." "Take it easy until next fall," his uncle said to David. "Wander around, get acquainted with the city, meet some of the people. Go to the library, visit a couple of schools if you like. Sort of get your feet on the ground and become oriented. The next fall you'll be all set." The talk at table was mostly what Grace and Terry were doing and the things that had happened during the day. The pond in Hunter's yard was frozen hard now, so Terry and his friends could ice skate. "You watch out for moose," Margaret said. "Gosh, this is right in the yard. No moose will come there." "One came right down the street a month or so ago and chased people," Aunt Margaret said. "It could happen again." "Okay," Terry said. "I'll watch." "Can you ice skate, Davy?" Grace asked. "No, there was too much snow on the river ice." "What did you do for fun?" she asked. David thought. "Not much, I guess. I hunted some in winter. In summer, I fished in the river and hiked around the country." "Didn't you have any friends to run around with?" she asked. "We lived outside of Aurora," David said. "There were only 10 other kids in school." "Then you were alone most of the time," she said with quick sympathy. "I guess so." Uncle George told about a moose that had charged a neighbor's car on the road that morning. Its horns punched a hole in the radiator and it smashed the hood before ambling off into the woods. "You see," Aunt Margaret said, "practically in the city, and you say this isn't frontier." "Did you have moose around your home?" Grace asked David. "I watched a cow and her calf all summer," David said. "That's nothing," Terry said. "We've seen moose tracks right here in the yard." "It's downright dangerous to go out," Aunt Margaret said. Uncle George smiled at David. After dinner, Grace and Aunt Margaret cleared the table and washed the dishes. David offered to help, but his aunt said, "We always do them together. Why don't you go into the living room and find something to read? We have a lot of magazines." He found a magazine and settled into a chair. Uncle George was reading the paper. Terry had gone to his room to do homework. David turned the pages idly, listening to the murmur of the female voices in the kitchen. Finally, that ceased, and Grace and his aunt came into the living room. His aunt sat under one of the floor lamps and began crocheting at something that looked like a sweater. Grace sat at the living room table with an open math book, scowling and chewing the end of her pencil. She worked and scowled for a time. "Davy, did you have to take math?" she asked suddenly. "Sure," David said. Uncle George lowered the paper. "What's wrong, honey?" "If a person pays $97.50 a year at the rate of 6% interest, how much has he borrowed? That's what's wrong. That's just principal rate times rate equals interest. Therefore, interest divided by rate equals principal," David said. "Clear as mud," Grace mumbled. "So who cares?" "I can show you." David glanced at his uncle. "Go ahead," he said. "Just don't let her con you into working the whole problem for her. She's got to learn. "Why?" Grace complained. "I'm not going to start out borrowing a whole bunch of money." "We've been over that before," Uncle George said. David pulled his chair up to the table and explained the problem. He stayed with Grace, pointing out mistakes and helping, while she worked a dozen problems. "Okay, I guess I can do it," she said finally, "but I still don't like math." An hour later, Grace finished the rest of her homework and said goodnight and went off to bed. Uncle George had laid down the paper. David hunted through it for the dog racing news. There was nothing about Smiley Jackson and Scrub. He told his uncle and aunt good night and went up to his attic room. "If you get cold, there's more blankets in the bottom of the dresser," his aunt called after him. David took his old clothing from the bag and hung it in the closet. He counted his money. 104 left. It seemed like a lot. When he considered the price of the clothing he'd bought today, he guessed it wasn't much to see him through until spring. He decided to put $90 away and keep the 14 in his wallet. He couldn't leave money lying out on top of the dresser. It should be put away. He finally stuffed it into the toe of one of his mucklucks and put the shoes away in the closet. He got into bed, but he could not sleep. The deep silence he had always known was gone. At intervals, cars went by on the street. A door slammed. Voices called into the night. Somewhere a car was stuck in the snow, and the motor ground and ground. The stairwell was a funnel that brought his uncle and aunt's voices up to him as clearly as if they were standing outside the room. They were talking about him. "What do you think of David?" his uncle asked. "I was hoping he wouldn't look so Indian. He's half. Why couldn't he look more like his father?" "I think he's a rather good-looking boy." "For an Indian, I suppose so." "You can't call him an Indian." "Maybe not technically," his aunt said, "but he certainly looks like one." "That's why you wanted him to get different clothing, wasn't it?" Uncle George asked. "Well, yes." "I just can't understand what your brother was thinking of." "Celia was a good-looking, intelligent woman, Margaret." David pulled the covers over his head so he'd hear no more. He felt sick and lonely. He didn't know when he slept, but the next thing he knew it was morning. After his uncle had left for work, and Grace and Terry for school, David tried to make himself useful around the house. Maybe they'd get used to him being part Indian if he caused no extra work and could help out. He wiped the dishes for his aunt, made his own bed, then went outside and shoveled the snow off the walk and street in front of the house. After that, there was nothing to do. His aunt suggested, "Why don't you start getting acquainted with Anchorage, David? Take a walk. We'll have lunch at 12. David hiked the few blocks to the main business district. He wandered up and down the streets, amazed at the number of people. He peered into store windows, fascinated by the display of clothing, jewelry, and sporting goods and tools. He stood for some time looking through the window of a restaurant, watching a cook making pancakes on a huge grill. Then he remembered Scotty's bacon pancakes and turned quickly away. It was noon before he realized it. He hurried home. Uncle George had come home for lunch, and the three of them ate together. Afterward, David went up to his room for a while. But there was nothing to do. He became restless and went back downtown. This time he found his way to the dock, where he saw his first ocean-going ship. He watched the loading and unloading of cargo a long time. Finally, he returned to the business district. He was idling when he saw Terry standing in front of a hardware store, admiring a small shotgun in the window. He had a pair of ice skates slung over his shoulder. "School out?" he asked. "Yeah." Terry kept looking at the gun. "Sure is a dandy," David said. "It's been in the window for a couple of months," Terry said. "It's just right for ptarmigans and small game. I sure would like to have it." He glanced at David. "I guess you've got your own gun." "I've got a rifle." "I wouldn't have any use for a rifle, but I'd sure like to have that." "If you're going home..." David said. I'll go with you. No, gotta meet some fellows. You go on. Terry walked off. A couple of blocks later, David saw Terry with 3 boys. They all carried ice skates. David walked about a while longer, then headed for home. As he turned into the block, he heard shouting and laughter. Terry and his friends were skating on a sheet of ice in a nearby yard. Snow had been scraped away, and water poured on the ground to form a small rink. David went over and stood watching. Terry didn't glance his way. After a minute, a tall boy skated over and said, "You can't stay here. This is private property." "I just stopped to watch," David said. "Terry's my cousin." The boy yelled, "Hey, Terry! The Indian says he's your cousin." Terry skated over, his lips tight. "Quit following me around, Davy," he said. "I wasn't following," David explained. "I was going home and saw you." "Then go, for Pete's sake. Find your own friends. There must be some Indians around town." The 2 boys skated away. The tall one said, "I didn't know you had a half-breed relative." "My uncle was stupid," Terry shot back. David started forward, then stopped. He shoved his fists into his pockets and walked off. A couple of nights later, he was standing on a corner, thinking it was about time to start home, when the school bus stopped and Grace got off. She waved at the kids and joined him on the sidewalk. "You going home, Davy?" "Yes, why?" "I'll walk home with you," she smiled. He didn't mean to say it, but it just popped out. "You don't mind? Walking home with you? Why should I? You're my cousin." "Just thought you might," he said evasively. "Why, Davy?" "No reason." She began walking backward in front of him, her small face framed in the hood serious. "Why?" She asked again. "If you're not careful, you'll fall down." "Because you're part Indian?" she asked. "Because you look like an Indian?" He looked at her and said nothing. "I heard those friends of Terry's talking at school. Terry's got some dopey friends. Don't you care what they say? I'm glad you're my cousin." She caught her heel and toppled over backward into a snowbank. Her school books went flying. "I told you," David warned her. She started to laugh and held out her hand. David pulled her up and brushed her off. He cleaned the snow off her books and said, "I'll carry these. You drop them in the snow about once more and they'll be ruined." As the days passed, David made no friends his own age. The kids were all in school. There was no one to meet. He sat about the house and helped his aunt whenever possible. He spent hours wandering about the city and its outskirts. Grace alone kept the loneliness from becoming unbearable. Almost every night he helped her with math. In the afternoon, he waited on the corner for her to get off the school bus. On these walks home, he told her about Aurora, his home, his parents, the trap line, and Scotty. He told her what it was like to run a team of dogs through winter silence so deep it made your ears ache. He told her about Scrub, not once, but many times. It helped ease his loneliness. She once asked, "Will you ever go back, Davy?" "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to." "I hope you stay with us always," she said. He smiled and reached for her load of books. "Let me carry those." "I'd like to see your home in Aurora and everything," she said, "and I'd like to see Scrub. Do you have any pictures of him?" "I never owned a camera," David said. A minute later, they passed the jewelry store. He glanced in the window, then gripped Grace's arm. "That's Scrub! It looks just like him." The object was a small Eskimo ivory carving of a sled dog. The figure stood braced on sturdy legs, head up, sharp ears pricked forward, bushy tail curved over its back. "That's the way he used to stand and look at me," David smiled. They squatted on their heels and stared through the window at the exquisitely carved dog. "It's beautiful," Grace said. "I wish I had it. I put it on my dresser by the light where I could always look at it. No wonder you loved him." "It cost $15. I know." They rose and went down the street. "I thought girls always wanted clothes and jewelry and things like that." "I'll want them someday when I get a lot older," Grace said practically. "But not now. I've always wanted a dog, but Mom says we can't keep one in the city. You've told me so much about Scrub that I feel like he's part mine, you being my cousin and all." She looked at him sideways. "You don't mind sharing him a little? Not with you." "Then I would like that ivory carving." "I see," said David, but he didn't. It snowed that night. The next morning, he cleared the street and walked in front of the house. Then he went downtown. He was headed for the docks to watch a ship loading and was passing a clothing store when a man said, "Hey, boy, you want a job?" "A job?" David asked. "Shovel the snow off the walk from here to the corner and I'll give you $5. He wasn't halfway through when the restaurant owner across the street asked him to do the same thing in front of his place. He did both jobs and made $8 that day. That gave him an idea. Instead of spending his days aimlessly wandering the streets, he went from business to business asking if they had any jobs. He got no more snow shoveling jobs, but some of them began hiring him for new hours to work in the back of their stores. He cleaned up helped uncrate merchandise and run errands. The money he made, he stuffed into the toe of his mucklucks with his other bills. He tried to arrange his job so he could meet Grace every night. If he wasn't on the corner waiting, she went home by bus. He was practically late one night unpacking sports equipment in the hardware store. On the way home, he hesitated to admire the little ivory dog in the jewelry store window. They were still open. On impulse, he went in and said to the salesman, "Can I see that carving of a dog in the window?" "It's $15, son." "I know." The man hesitated. "If you break it, you'll have to pay for it. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Well, all right." The salesman got the dog. David turned it over in his hands. He felt the legs and the sharp ears. He looked into the face of the carving and visualized Scrub's amber eyes, the way the dog would look up into his face and push his big head into his chest and have his ears scratched. He heard again the drum hollow sound when he patted the deep chest. He remembered the day they learned to walk together. $15 wasn't important. Having the little ivory carving was. He got out his purse and quickly counted out the money. "Will you wrap it up real good? I'll put it in a box with cotton. You've got a nice carving there." "Yes, sir," David said. With the box in his pocket, he hurried home. Dinner was over, and Aunt Margaret and Grace had cleared the table. His aunt said, "Good heavens, David, where have you been? We waited and waited. Uncle George was about to start out looking for you." "I'm sorry," he said. "I was uncrating stuff at the hardware store. It took longer than I thought." "You're working quite a lot." She looked at him closely. "You aren't broke, are you? I thought you had some left to tide you over until your friend sells your fur and traps." "I have." "That's fine," she said, "but try to get home in time for dinner after this." Uncle George asked, "David, you aren't carrying all your money with you?" "No, I left it in my room." "Good. You could get your pockets picked or lose it." Later, when he went upstairs to his room, David unwrapped the little statue and put it on the night table beside the bed. He sat and looked at it, thinking about Scrub, wondering where he was, how many races he'd won, how he was, and if the dog remembered him. Somehow, as David looked at the little statue, Scrub didn't seem quite so far away. And that's the end of Chapter 9.